Hey everybody, this is Mr. Munson, and we are in Unit 9, Logic and Reasoning. We're going to be dealing with concept number 2, which is conditional statements, basically logical consequences. Sometimes that gets a bad word, as a bad word in some people's lives, consequences, but it just basically means that if something happens, then something else will happen. It's a logical consequence.
Okay,
Okay,
let's get started.
very good. So 9.2, we're looking at conditional statements. And so basically conditional statements have a if, then kind of template to it, okay? The first part, the words that go in this first part are called the hypothesis. And the second part is called the conclusion. So now we can take statements like I have, it would be like I have a nerve and I would be brave. We can take statements like that and put them into the template and create a conditional statement. If I had a nerve, then I would be brave. That's called a conditional statement. Now over here to the right, I could change all that group of words into a symbolic form and go from the verbal form to the symbolic form. If I had a nerve, then I would be brave. What I want you to know is that more generally, just in the sense of understanding conditional statements, P then Q is the typical phrase that we'll use when we're just talking about in general. Like there's not a specific conditional statement we're dealing with. We're just talking about conditional statements in general. What I want you to know about the hypothesis and conclusion, these statements over here, they do not include the if and the then. So if I ask you to write the hypothesis of this statement here, right, we have this conditional statement. If I ask you to write the hypothesis for this statement, you would just simply write, I had a nerve. That would be the hypothesis. It does not include the if part of that statement. The same is true for the conclusion. The conclusion does not have the then in it. Keep that in mind. That's kind of a warning. You might want to write yourself a note. Now we've covered these through our vocabulary words, but let's just make sure we understand it. Suppose I was given some conditional statement, P then Q. I can write its converse just by simply switching the position of the main ingredients, the statements. That's the converse. I can write its inverse by taking the original statement and negating both sides. Remember, when we negate something that's already got a not sign in front of it, a negation of a not becomes positive. You can go back to Unit 1 or 9.1's video to see how we talked about that. A contrapositive is the combination of the converse and the inverse being applied to the statement twice. So I would take the Q and the P and I'd switch it, and then I would negate it. So we end up by negating the Q and negating the P. Okay, over on the left I have a statement there. If the measure of angle A is 15 degrees, then then angle A is acute, and I think we all agreed that that is a true statement. So let's just put a T up there for it being true. All right, now what I want you to do is I want you to take that statement and I want you to go ahead and write the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive of that statement. Do the best you can. Refer back to how I manipulated it over here to get each one. So go ahead and try to think these through and come up with your own. Put me on pause. Okay, I have my conditional statements here written, the converse, the inverse, and the contrapositive. Go ahead and put me on pause if you like. Just connect and make sure that you have the same thing as me. Okay, so we started off with a conditional statement that we said was true, and I agree with that. The converse says this: if angle A is an acute angle, then it equals 15 degrees. Now I think that's definitely a false statement. Now since I wrote it's a false statement, I have to write a counter example. So there's my counterexample. An angle that is 20 degrees is an acute angle, but it's not 15 degrees. Okay, so I gave an example of an acute angle, 20 degrees, but it's not equal to 15. Okay, obviously. All right, let me shrink things down and make some things bigger to get to our next point. So the next one, inverse. If angle A is not equal to 15, then it's not an acute angle. Well, let's see if we can come up with a counterexample of that, because that's definitely false. All right, so here's my counterexample. Suppose the measure of angle A is equal to 115, which is not equal to 15 degrees, which is showing the first thing came true, right? An angle that's not equal to 15. But it's not acute either, so I can't assume that it would be acute. And actually, I'm sorry, I actually made a mistake there, so I'm going to erase that and fix it. All right, this is better. Suppose angle A is equal to 20 degrees, which is not 15, so I just created a situation where the first thing happened. It's not equal to 15, but it's still an acute angle, right, which shows that the second thing didn't come true. My inverse says that if it's not 15, then it must not be acute. Well, this is definitely a counterexample that shows that that's not true. All right, let's take a look at the converse, or contrapositive. All right, and the contrapositive says if the angle is not acute, then it's not equal to 15 degrees. That is actually a true statement. All right, so if the angle is not acute, which means it has to be either a right or greater than, then there's no way it could be equal to 15 degrees. Okay, because it's got to be something larger than 90 degrees. 90 degrees or larger. Okay? Now, what I want you to learn from this is that whenever you're given a conditional statement, you can write yourself in this own words, your big, huge idea, whatever. Whenever you're given a P then Q statement that's true, its contrapositive is always true. Okay, these two are actually in the logical sense, they're identical to each other. They sound different, but they're identical to each other. Now, if the converse is false or the inverse is false, it's really up to the problem. We have to, it's case by case, take a look at that. All right, let's take a look at this conditional statement. All right, so what I'd like you to do is I'd like you to go ahead and do two things. One, and I'll tell you second thing in just a minute. The first thing I want you to do is write its converse. But before you do, I want you to look at this original conditional statement. This if an angle measures less than 90 degrees, then it's an acute. And I want you to declare, is it true or false? Okay? And then I want you to go ahead and write its converse. Put me on pause. Come back and check your work. All right, now this is sometimes what students will write. If it's an acute angle, then the measure is less than 90. Now I want you to be careful. I took the it is acute, but I added the word angle to it, right? When we do this, if I wrote if it is acute, then the measure is less than 90. That really is, in the sense of a sentence structure, doesn't make any sense at all. So you might move the pieces around, but you have to look back at the sentence that you create and make sure it makes sense. And hopefully you agree that that's a true statement. Well, if you look at this statement as well, it's true. If it's an acute angle, then the measure is less than 90 degrees. Now what we find is that whenever you have an original statement and write its converse, and they're both true, then we can write it as a biconditional statement. All right, I have an angle's measure, let's put the apostrophe there, is less than 90 degrees if and only if the angle is acute. So if you take a look, the main ingredients over here, and this one is the hypothesis, is an angle's measure is less than 90 degrees, and this one it's acute, or the angle's acute. And I just put those pieces with the if and only if in between them. Now, I could have very well done it this way. Excuse me. Of course, I'd want to make a capital T there, and the angle is acute. That doesn't make sense at all, so I'd change that to an angle is acute if and only if an angle measure, that angle measure, right? So I just kind of massage this to make sure it makes sense, that if and only if that angle measure is less than 90 degrees, okay? So it doesn't matter which one comes first, which one comes second, but if the conditional statement, the original conditional statement, is true and the converse is true, then we can rewrite it as one of these biconditional. Okay, that's it. Draw your line, write your summary. Now, what I would also want you to do is take a look at your student learning map. Over on the far right-hand side is your vocabulary words for this unit, or for this section. Make sure you could identify the definitions for each one of those if given them by next class. Okay, let's go ahead and go do our do it problems. All right, well, there's your do it problems for this section. And so I'll scroll in, zoom in a little closer and scroll through them. Hey, listen, through this section, you're going to need to make sure that you're doing your work neat. Some of you are turning in work that I can't read, and so I'm just taking off points for that. If it's just you're doing it too fast, you need to slow down. Make sure you write in there all the words and then circle your answers and things like that. All right, remember, your job is to come in next time with these problems done 100%, not blank because you didn't know how to do them.